December 11th, 2012, the 150th anniversary of the Union Army forcing its way across the Rappahannock River and seizing Fredericksburg. Tonight I want to talk about war coming to Fredericksburg. And I thought about this title very specifically, War Comes to Fredericksburg, because a lot of what we've been talking about for the last couple of months has been quite the inverse of that, and that is, in 1861, Fredericksburg went to war. Now, going to war in 1861 meant that Fredericksburg waved flags and it decorated its homes with bunting and streamers, and it listened to rousing oratory, and it raised troops and made them uniforms and sent them off to war to fight somewhere else, somewhere romantically glorious, they should hope. They had pride and enthusiasm. And then the war came to Fredericksburg. And that was different, much different. In fact, it came first as a Confederate encampment that brought new faces to Fredericksburg. And then it came as a Union occupation in the spring of 1862, which was strained but civilized. And fighting occurred elsewhere, to the north and to the south. But Fredericksburg saw the enemy more as an irritant rather than as a conqueror. In November 1862, both sides showed up here. And their numbers were legion. In fact, they were 10 times the former numbers that had ever camped here. And this time, those numbers came here to fight. Tonight marks precisely the 150th anniversary of the beginning of the Battle of Fredericksburg. This is a brief, intense moment of white-heat passion. It is a moment that changed the city and its landscape forever. Fredericksburg going to war was a personal and parochial experience. It was a shared community pride and memory. The disturbing and the disgusting elements of war were seemingly remote and easily dismissed from memory. Even the tragedy of death, taken in small, discrete doses, could be glorified, if not deified. It was a story of a community, and it could be relatively easy to manage and massage. War coming to Fredericksburg was something else. It was a gathering of armies, the marshaling of soldiers from all over, with their instruments and devices of destruction, and the commitment to use them with deadly intent. It was not a local experience. It was a national experience, with national and international consequences. Men traveled and marched hundreds, thousands of miles to be here 150 years ago this evening. They came from Maine and Mississippi. They came from California and the Carolinas. They donned uniforms just as lovingly prepared as the ones that were done here in Fredericksburg for their soldiers when they sent their citizens off to war. The uniforms were all of different hues, conveying a different idea of nation. But they were also all faded, conveying an ongoing shared experience of struggle and war. War coming to Fredericksburg is a collective story of different nature, with hundreds of thousands of integral parts, relentless, remorseless, and sometimes completely ungovernable by history. There's an irony in this, and the irony is that Fredericksburg is a collection of individual stories of a community, and war at Fredericksburg is a community of stories of individuals that from its sheer size, weight, and magnitude completely surrounds and consumes the smaller, discrete story, the organized story of this community. This is really just a long way for me to get around to the idea that there are two ideas of community engaged in the perception and the story of this one cathartic act, the Battle of Fredericksburg. Fredericksburg, the town, became a community besieged by outsiders and bombarded, literally, by soldiers who cared very little for this community. just as they had not cared very much for Manassas, or Winchester, or Sharpsburg. Fredericksburg, the battle, the war, was a community of armed men, soldiers, strangers to this land for the most part, who had marshaled and fought and died for greater stakes, the greatest stakes, stakes bigger than any single community of civilians or non-combatants. And it left its wounded and its maimed and despoiled desolation in its wake. The inexorable trail of success and excess, of fright and inevitable blight ultimately led to this community, our community, on the Rappahannock River, Fredericksburg. Those enormous bands of armed men brought the eyes of the world to our streets, to our very homes, exactly 150 years ago this evening. From then on, Fredericksburg was caught in a whirlwind of death and destruction, the terrible grip of war. And its story, first and foremost and fundamental, became the story of armies in a death struggle in the midst of a populous area of civilians who saw their backyards suddenly transformed into battlefields, their homes transformed into hospitals, and their gardens into graveyards. We're all familiar with the overview on the Battle of Fredericksburg. The Union dashed to Fredericksburg in November 1862, only to be quashed when their pontoon bridges failed to arrive and they could not cross. Robert E. Lee's initial surprise when the Union Army showed up here, and then his quick recovery to occupy this area. The Union thrust across the river 150 years ago this very day. And the unprecedented novelty of street fighting at exactly this moment, right in our very midst. The looting, the impregnable Confederate defenses at Marie's Heights and Prospect Hill, the forlorn Union assaults with a momentary breakthrough, the deplorable destruction of property, the profound destruction of life. For the most part, all of these things are the story of strategy and tactics, the story of generals and leaders. And while it's interesting, I have to admit, it's pretty thin. It encompasses basically a paragraph. What makes Fredericksburg truly unique and enduring is how the stories of Fredericksburg have evolved essentially into a story of soldiers and their most visceral experiences. Theirs are the voices of the community that engulfed Fredericksburg and made it part of their own. Their voices are numbered in the thousands, so we have to pick and choose to find something of a thread or a rhythm to carry us through them. I'll only pick a couple of them tonight. I want to talk about the men who spoke to me while I was writing about Fredericksburg. The men who surprised me, shocked me, amazed me, taught me. I was amazed at the men who spoke of anticipation coming into this battle. A young captain in the U.S. Engineers, Wesley Brainerd, was responsible for the upper pontoon crossing at Fredericksburg. He took one look at that site where he was supposed to lay a bridge at Hawk Street, and then went back to his camp writing, "After we had pondered the situation well, we all came to the conclusion that we might now return to our quarters and with great propriety execute our last wills and testaments." For him, the idea of laying a bridge at Hawk Street seemed to him to be madness. His best friend and tent mate was a fellow captain named Augustus S. Perkins, who even had a greater foredoof about what awaited him. He was certain that he was now in his last day. 150 years ago this very day, Augustus Perkins was shot on the banks of the Rappahannock River and died instantly. According to Brainerd, poor fellow, it was his last ride. Perkins had a sergeant who served under him, a man named Thomas J. Owen. And Owen was responsible for Perkins' body. He took it home to Pennsylvania to be buried. And Owen admitted that while attending the funeral, for the first time, he had become more unnerved by that funeral, that community, than he was by the battle at Fredericksburg itself. He wrote, "Up to this time, I had not fully realized what war was. This was the first time I witnessed the great sorrow of friends at home over the loss of their sons and brothers killed in war, and it left an impression on my mind that I shall never forget." If we turn the clock back a century and a half this morning at 1 a.m., Wesley Brainerd spent the last hour before starting his bridges on the Potomac or on the Rappahannock writing to his family. He began his letter with the simple phrase, "Dear Father, tonight the grand tragedy comes off." On this side of the river, Confederates also anticipated this moment, but with a much different vision or light. A Confederate artillerist named Edward Porter Alexander had anticipation this night. He waited for it. He expected it. He wrote, "We are now about to measure our strength with the largest and best equipped army that has ever stood upon a battlefield in America. But our own army was better organized and stronger than ever before. And now, finding itself concentrated at exactly the right moment, it was confident and elated as if the victory had already been won." I doubt that Wesley Brainerd, the engineer, would have argued with him. Some of these men spoke of pure dread as they got ready for battle here at Fredericksburg. An officer in the 3rd South Carolina Infantry up at the foot of Lee Hill, just off Lee Drive. A man named Lieutenant D. Augustus Dickert was told to summon everyone into ranks and get them ready for the battle, and one of their captains was missing, a man named John Calhoun Summer. As he went looking for this gruff, bluff officer who was always the life of the party and the voice of the regiment, Dickert found him off by himself, kneeling behind a bush and saying a prayer for the first time in his entire life. He was not a pious man. D. Augustus Dickert was rather surprised at this behavior and teased him unmercifully, saying that he was weakening for his sudden piety. To which the captain stood up and looked him dead in the eye and said earnestly, "I am no coward, and will show you that I have as much nerve, if not more, than most of the men in this army. For all have doubts of death, but I have none. I will be killed in this battle. I feel it as plainly as I feel I can live it. But I am no coward, and I shall go into this battle and fight with the same spirit I have always had." The first 5 minutes into action, Summer was shot in the temple and killed instantly. His last conversation was with D. Augustus Dickert. A Union 9th Corps soldier who looked at the floodplain outside of Fredericksburg started to cry. He bawled out loud, "Oh dear, they'll kill every one of us. Not a damn one of us will be left to tell the story." And one is left to wonder if he was worried about his mortality or worried that the story would not survive either. Another Union officer who looked at the open floodplain south of Fredericksburg realized that they would have to cross nearly a mile of open space without houses or trees or fences or any cover of any sort. And he thought there was no possible way that they could survive on that open killing field. Across the way, a Tennessee private on Prospect Hill trembled when he looked at that exact same field. He didn't have to cross it, but what he saw across that field was fully half the Union Army, he said. He could see 60,000 men in a panorama at one fell swoop. And he said they were so large that they threatened to swallow us whole. It's an amazing perspective as two men looked at a place that would soon be called the Slaughter Pen Farm. Interestingly, these men, despite their fears, did their duty. And at least the last two, I can tell you, survived to tell about it. They spoke of horror here in the streets and on the battlefield. In fact, this is probably the most graphically depicted battle of all the contemporary literature I have ever seen in the Civil War. I personally have been accused of being macabre and grotesque with my horrific descriptions of death and mutilation here at Fredericksburg. Never mind it. All those terrible phrases I was accused of writing were inside the quotation marks and were the words of those who had seen them and experienced them. Soldiers coming across the Rappahannock River were greeted by fresh graves on the riverside. They were met by embalmers hawking their wares, handing out business cards to soldiers going into battle, promising to retrieve their bodies and send them back almost lifelike to their loved ones. These were the men who went out on this battlefield, just a couple of blocks from where we're sitting tonight, who saw their captain get hit in the stomach by a shell, which cartwheeled his body through the ranks like a pinwheel until he stopped about 35 yards back from where he was hit. They could tell us about feeling Warren Webster's head explode and his skull transformed into a projectile that knocked a man out. One startled man looked at Webster's corpse, amazed, as he, quote, rolled over. The blood spurted from his neck as water comes from a pump until his heart pumped the body dry. This battle gives us the fourth of 5 color bearers for the 35th Massachusetts Infantry. A man who lost both his arms when a shell exploded directly in his face, and his blood stained his flag. Sergeant Thomas Plunkett lived to tell about this. In fact, Plunkett went on to become significantly the doorman, the sergeant at arms for the Massachusetts State Assembly, a man who couldn't open a door at all. And in fact, assemblymen felt it an honor to open the door for themselves, just to be in the presence of Plunkett. These men spoke of commitment here. E. Porter Alexander actually put his phrases to work. The young Confederate artillerist was responsible for laying out all the artillery positions at Marie's Heights and to the north, past Mary Washington Hospital, on to Stansbury Hill, and up to Taylor Hill. He had to defy a number of the people above him to get what he wanted, to do it just right. He defied his corps commander, James Longstreet, who insisted that there weren't enough guns placed in the main line. Porter Alexander told him that there were just the perfect number of guns, and when he opened on that field, a chicken couldn't live on it. And later he proved that right. He defied James Longstreet's boss, General Robert E. Lee, when he placed his guns directly on the foremost crest of places like Marie's Heights, in an exposed position, with only a little bit of dirt to protect those guns. That wasn't how it was done by the book. And Engineer Lee yelled at the engineers erecting these works, saying they had done it wrong. The engineers, greatly embarrassed for being called on the carpet, insisted that Porter Alexander needed to, quote, come take his. And as Porter Alexander went to explain it to Lee, Lee cut him off short and said, Colonel Alexander, look where they put these pits. It's all wrong, sir. They're in the wrong place, sir. They need to move them back, sir. And then he left. He had spoken. And this was the law. As the engineers started to pack in their gear and move it, Porter Alexander insisted that they stay right where they were and finish the job. They kept those pits to the front, and those guns got to play on every inch of that battlefield, as opposed to being pushed back and only having a limited window of opportunity. In the end, those guns were the decisive feature that made Marie's Heights impregnable. After the battle, Porter Alexander, still young and exuberant, we know this because he's proclaimed, I was young and exuberant, found himself sitting on a log next to Robert E. Lee. And he said in his youthfulness, he couldn't resist. And he gave him a little elbow and just whispered, you know, I was right. To which Robert E. Lee abruptly stood up and walked away. Porter Alexander was mortified. He thought he had just ruined his career. Turns out, from that moment on out, any assignment, any decision that needed to be made with the artillery was all given to Porter Alexander. He had proven himself by his conviction to even stand up to Lee himself. In these cases, I'm amazed that men can stand up to their enemies, and that does amaze me. But in this case, this was a man who stood up to his friends, and that's even more difficult. Another who did it was a brigadier general from Georgia, a man named Thomas Reed Roots Cobb. Cobb defied both Lee and Longstreet as well, when they suggested that he should abandon his position along the sunken road in the stone wall. Now, Cobb was a Georgian, but his family hailed from Fredericksburg. His maternal grandmother's home was Federal Hill, and you could see it plainly from his position. And it became something of a sore point with him. He was defiant. He wanted to hold that sunken road, and he wanted to punish the Union Army. He wrote to his wife, "We can hear their bands and drums plainly, and it makes my blood boil to hear them." Even moments before the battle began, Lee and Longstreet were not sure that that position could hold, or it could be sustained. And they sent a note to him just moments before the Union Army attacked, saying that if the general needed to pull back, they would cover for him immediately. The operative word. General Cobb sent a fairly irreverent response back, saying that if they will wait for him, they'll wait a long time. And in fact, it was his conviction that turned the sunken road into a hallmark of defensive tactics. And it taught us afterwards that if you have a stone wall, use it. And if you don't have a stone wall, make one. And that's why trench warfare becomes so acceptable after Fredericksburg, where it was resisted so much and so heartily before Fredericksburg. When everything was said and done, Cobb's men inflicted almost 8,000 casualties from the sunken road. They sustained less than 1,000 themselves. The wall protected them. But I'm also amazed at people that can change their minds and do it with a genuineness of spirit. A Union brigadier or a Union major general named Darius Nash Couch commanded the Union 2nd Corps. And he got into a lot of trouble because he criticized Ambrose Burnside's plan to cross the Rappahannock. Burnside was so irate, he summoned all the 2nd Corps officers together, and together he lectured them that he had not brought them to the point of sharing his plan so that they could argue. He brought them the plan so that they could obey. And many of the officers were embarrassed and uncertain, and it was Couch who decided to set the tone. And he stood up and instantly pledged himself, saying that if he had ever done anything in this war, he would do twice as much at Fredericksburg. He had voiced his criticisms. They had gone unfulfilled. Now he was going to do everything in his power to make sure that Burnside's vision would come to fruition. Of course, it was a failed attempt, but at the same time, the spirit was pure. The actions of these men on these battlefields, many of them depicted all around these walls, show us individuals and collections of individuals, fighting as one, fighting as many. But each of these men are in a different pose. Each of them expresses themselves in just a little different way. And that, again, is a symphony of voices and experiences, a harmony of all of them in one big experience. I'm amazed at the various stories that come out of this. The idea of Confederate sharpshooters clinging to the rubble of our demolishing town this very day in the midst of a firestorm on December 11th, 1862, and defying the Union Army, holding it at bay, hour after thousands of Union shells are hurled into this city. Houses collapsing down around their heads. Not a single pane of glass left intact in this city. Streets that have been hit by so many shells that they are deeply furrowed as if they had been tilled by a farmer. I'm amazed at the pontooniers. The engineers who repeatedly go out on these same bridges, time and time again, at 5 a.m. this morning, 7 a.m. this morning, 10 a.m. this morning, noontime, and 4 p.m. Every time being met by a horrific fire on the other side of the river and being stopped dead in their tracks, quite literally dead in their tracks. 3 bridge commanders were killed or wounded trying to get this bridge put across. At one point, a volunteer regiment, the 8th Connecticut Infantry, was solicited to come out there and make good their losses and help them finish this bridge. Those men took a look at a scene exactly like this, and they wouldn't even touch the bridge. They wouldn't even go near the span. To do it was suicide, and they left. Which means who finishes the bridge? The men who started it. The same men who go out on that bridge time and time and time again, with the full realization that every time they go there, it's only going to get more difficult, and they're going to lose more people. And that astounds me that they still go anyway. I'm amazed at men who get into open boats like these pontoons and ferry themselves across the Rappahannock River under intense fire with no means of protecting themselves or hiding in these boats, and doing something almost completely and utterly unnerving: a riverine assault under fire. In the 20th century, in the 21st century, that would make perfect sense to us. That's rational. The only way you'll get the bridges done is if you own both banks. And in this case, this day, there wasn't a single soldier who got into a boat who had ever thought of doing such a thing, who had ever read about such a thing, who had ever prepared or planned or practiced such a thing. And that's probably the most unnerving thing of all. They were inventing on the fly. They were doing this by instinct rather than by drill. And yet they did it. And when they did this, this was the first riverine crossing under fire in American military history. They were rewriting history. And that led to other elements of rewriting history too. The Confederates defying them, fighting house by house, street by street, block by block. In one of the very first urban combats, Keith Rocco has done a marvelous job replicating in the back. I'm amazed at other people who performed in this battle. Major John Pelham of Alabama, a maverick officer, young, seemingly immortal. He saw an opportunity to plant one Confederate cannon squarely on the end of the Union line and defy it for an entire hour, single-handedly, holding the Union Army at bay on December 13th. And for that, even Robert E. Lee paused and admired him and called him the gallant Pelham. It's his greatest act, and yet one of his last. Pelham would be dead within 3 months, killed in combat at Kelly's Ford. But he left an indelible impression on history with what he had brought to our community and what he had done here. I'm also amazed at another Confederate artillerist, a captain named William J. Pegram, or Willie Pegram. He was a man who, on the surface, you would not take to be a warrior. He was a fellow who had a perfect, prim look about him, thick Coke bottle glasses. He looked more like a choir boy than a soldier. He was blind as a bat. And every time they'd fire the guns, the soot that came off those guns would completely coat his glasses. And he would have to habitually take them off and clean them and put them back on to judge his fire. But he never once thought of not being there. At Prospect Hill, on the southern end of the field at Fredericksburg, they were in a virtual firestorm on December 13th. For the only time in the history of Pegram's battery, the men abandoned their position, abandoned their guns, and fled into the woods for cover. Willie Pegram, the most unassuming personage of them all, was horrified. And he went directly to his colors and ripped them off the staff and draped it over his shoulders like a toga and stalked back and forth behind his empty guns until he shamed his men back to their posts. At the end of the battle, when the guns were being replaced, he insisted that his had to stay. I was struck by a Confederate colonel named Robert McMillan of the 24th Georgia. He took command of the sunken road after General Cobb was mortally wounded within eyesight of his maternal grandmother's home. And Colonel McMillan walked back and forth behind the lines, reassuring the men that there was still a strong hand in command. When he stood behind his own regiment, in fact stood directly in front of his son, Garnet, a Union bullet found him and caught him square in the chest and dropped him in his steps. Young son Garnet immediately shouted out simply, "Pa, are you hurt?" To which the man breathlessly answered, "Hit, but not hurt." The ball had deflected off something, it was spent. I gave him a nice big bruise on his chest, and it fell flat at his feet. In remarkable bravado, Colonel McMillan picked up the ball, examined it, stuck it in his pocket, and then made it into a watch fob as his memento of Fredericksburg. Lieutenant Colonel John L. Harris of the 24th North Carolina was shot in the leg defending the sunken road right next to McMillan. And what amazed me about him is that he refused to leave the line. Even though he was bleeding freely from his wound, he ignored it and continued to press on at command throughout the battle. And he explained very succinctly, without any bravado whatsoever, officers are noticed closely in battles, and if the men see their officers shunning the bullets, they'll get frightened. So it behooved him to stay, to keep his men calm, and they could perform. Now, some of the soldiers that I encountered were ridiculous. They do odd things under odd circumstances. When you throw men into irrational moments, sometimes they respond irrationally. Here in the streets of Fredericksburg and out in front of the sunken road in Marie's Heights, Union soldiers came under an intense fire of artillery and then small arms, bullets. And almost without fail, almost every regiment that went out experienced the same thing. Men universally hiked their collars and started pulling their hats down as if they were walking into a rainstorm rather than a battlefield, as if that would change things. On the southern end of the battlefield, the 19th Georgia Infantry found their position turned, with Union soldiers firing into the front, into the side, and into the back of their trenches. As they ran for their lives, they ran a gauntlet of fire, sometimes only 20 paces away from the Union soldiers. And as they ran for their lives, they would hold their canteens up beside their heads, or just their hands beside their heads, as if that would ward off the bullets at point-blank range and save their lives. And who knows, maybe it did. I was amazed at the number of men who thought ahead, and they bought bulletproof vests, iron vests, heavy, almost impossible to wear. You would wipe out a man even before he could get out on the battlefield. Most of them discarded them when they realized much of it was junk, and it was too much of a burden to carry without that promise of certainty. Not everybody threw it away, and one of them, a major named Sidney Ward, his worked. He was shot square in the chest. There was a tremendous clang, and the bullet was deflected right down into his groin. As the men tried to lift him and take him off the field, he was too heavy because he had an iron vest. So they had to leave him in the mill race on the edge of town, where he breathlessly told his captain, "God's will be done. Tell them I tried to do my duty to my country and to my regiment." He died the next day. A North Carolinian named Noah Collins was right along this very stretch of railroad on the southern end of the battlefield near the slaughter pit. He watched thousands of Union soldiers coming towards him that day, and that unnerved him. And he laid down for cover underneath the embankment of the railroad. As those around him could see that this man was plainly unnerved, they teased him and kept telling him, "The Yankees are getting closer. The Yankees are getting closer." And almost invariably, every time, he would shout out, "Oh Lordy," and then instinctually fire his weapons straight up into the air. His captain had to come by and gently remind him, in his good-natured way, "You don't need to shoot up there. There's no Yankees in heaven." Lieutenant Colonel Samuel Walkup of the 48th North Carolina was wounded in the hip while standing on top of Marie's Heights near Brompton. One of his underlings, a lieutenant named William F. Beasley, didn't even recognize that his commander was wounded because he stood his ground and stayed in position. But Beasley had been shot through the fleshy part of his thigh and went stumbling over to him looking for sympathy. He shouted out that he was wounded and, quote, "told me to tell his mother he died, a true Southern soldier at his post." Walkup told him that it was only a flesh wound and that Walkup himself had a much more serious wound than that, and that man just needed to go back because he wasn't going to die anytime soon. Beasley and Walkup both resumed their post and stayed throughout the entire battle, perfectly fine. Two soldiers acted out a comic opera on top of Marie's Heights. Two North Carolinians, one of them a man named Henry C. Clegg, were laying on the top of that hill, trying to be as small as possible under artillery fire. And at one point, a piece of shrapnel kissed the back of Clegg's uniform, and he instantly thought he had been mortally struck down. It surprised him so that he thrashed, and his foot kicked the man next to him, who instantly started bawling that he had been struck down. And as the two of them looked at each other and realized that they had been mortally struck, they thought they needed to get the other to the hospital. And as they stumbled back from the crest, they took a survey of their wounds and realized that neither one of them had been hit. And then sheepishly came back to the line. Out on the slaughter pen, another strange event occurred. Union soldiers had crossed an open space only to be repulsed, and as they fell back, Confederates counterattacked hard on their heels. Union soldiers, some of them unable to escape, took shelter in a ditch, and the Confederates went right past them. When the Confederates were repulsed in turn, they too went seeking shelter and wound up in that same ditch. So Pennsylvanians and Georgians met each other face to face. A captain from Georgia named James D. von Valkenburg took a survey of the situation and immediately said all the Union soldiers were now his prisoners. One of them, a private named David Carradine, said he didn't see it that way. And suggested that neither one of them had captured the other, and it would be entirely up to which army sent their armed troops forward first that would determine the fate of the other. Van Valkenburg was harsh and hard and critical, but as minutes ticked away into hours, he and Carradine actually found détente. They even shared a canteen together. And several hours later, a Pennsylvania unit got to that ditch first, and Van Valkenburg was the prisoner. And Private Carradine escorted him to the rear, but not with animosity. They exchanged addresses so that they might correspond. What makes this story even more amazing to me is that just a year and a half later, and just 17 miles down the road, is the Battle of the Wilderness. And these same two armies are going to engage there. And liberated Captain James D. Van Valkenburg is going to discover a Union regiment out in the middle of the field, surrounded by woods. And he will bluff them single-handedly into surrendering, convincing them that he had them surrounded. Of all the regiments in all the world he captured Carradine's regiment. There's something amazing about that. There was a Union general who spent the night of December 11th about 2 blocks from where we are tonight. His name was Alfred Sully. He was actually the son of the great artist Thomas Sully. And When he attacked downtown, he came right past this spot and went one more block down to George Street before he entered into the battlefield. I put him under the ridiculous because how he was hurt in the battle. He was knocked out. He was unconscious. And he was knocked senseless by a Union soldier running for his life. The last thing that Alfred Sully heard before everything went black was the words, "Don't stop me, I'm demoralized as hell." Another Union brigadier general named A. Sanders Piatt was also carted off this battlefield on a stretcher. His troops had been fighting they hadn't been fighting at all. They were in a relatively quiet spot down by the Mary Washington Monument, far removed from the attacks against Marie's Heights. But General Sanders Piatt had to be taken away, and his was an inglorious wound. He attempted to jump his horse over a ditch, and he fell off the back and wrenched his back. It was the last time he would ever command a brigade. Probably the most ludicrous of them all was a brigadier general named Andrew Atkinson Humphreys, who commanded a division of Pennsylvanians and was the last major attack against the stone wall, and arguably one of the closest to the wall. And this was a man who had never been in battle, and he was leading troops who had never fired an angry shot in their entire life. One soldier said that they had never done anything more fearsome and military than maybe kill a cat once in their lives. And now they were thrust into the battlefield with a maniacal commander who wanted glory and was anxious to take them as close to the fight as he could get them. His men were slaughtered, and he had no remorse about it whatsoever, because each and every one of them was glorious. His own son was wounded, and he ran over to the young man and chucked him on the shoulder, saying, "I'm proud of you, my boy, for catching lead." When his first attack failed, he insisted as honor-bound to be the last one to leave, and he walked backwards so that the Confederates could not shoot him in the back. Just to show his defiance, to let them know he was not beaten, he went back whistling. A very airy little tune called "I'll Be Gay and Happy." He grabbed another brigade and he took them into the fight, and he got them slaughtered as well. His horse was shot out from under him, and he jumped up, and this time he insisted that the entire rear guard walk back with him, backwards. And this time, he led them in a song. They had to sing, and he picked the song, "I'll Be Fat and Greasy in the Morning Still," just to show those Confederates that they could beat their attack, but they could not break their will. If that was the inspired effect, I'm afraid that it was misplaced with the Confederates. The Confederate commander opposite him was a man named Robert Ransom. Robert Ransom reported, without any sense of irony, that I beat back wave after wave of attackers, but I sent the last attack back howling. And some of these soldiers weren't ridiculous at all, but they were pathetic. The one soldier who amazed me more than any is a fellow that I could never use in my book, because there was no real place for him, but he was the one who touched me the most. One of Humphrey's soldiers went into those death-dealing attacks, those suicidal assaults, and he watched all his friends get wiped out. And he sat down about a block away from us within an hour of that attack, within an hour of facing his mortality, and he wrote to his father. And the thing that makes it pathetic is that he never once mentioned the battle. He never once talked about Fredericksburg or anything that happened here. What did this young man write about within an hour of fighting at Fredericksburg in front of the terrible stone wall? He wrote to his father that he was sure that there would be some plausible explanation why his wife had left their children out on the sidewalk and had run off with the tailor from the next town. But he also admonished his father, saying, "I don't want you to speak harshly of her, because when I come home, she will come back. And I don't want it to be hard between you two." That was what was the prevailing thought on this man as he faced life and death in our streets. Not the bullets and the shells, but getting his wife back. The man went home after the war. His wife didn't. I don't know when he realized that moment was coming, but here in December of 1862, he was clinging against reason, even in spite of his environment, where he was completely surrounded by unreasonableness. And that is one of the most touching and pathetic scenes I have seen out of this entire war. And some of these men were just downright sublime. A simple sprig of boxwood, an innocuous piece of Fredericksburg itself, in fact, would become probably the most profound, universal symbol of the Irish Brigade, and also of the death-dealing struggle here at Fredericksburg. Fredericksburg and boxwood are synonymous. You can speak about it anywhere in the world, and people will know what you're talking about, because it's that indelible. I'm amazed at individuals who do things that I simply cannot fathom. I was impressed by a young Pennsylvania soldier named John Kistler, the 132nd Pennsylvania. He was entering into probably one of his very first battles. He may have fought at Antietam, but he was definitely here today. And on December 13th, as his troops got ready to go out on the field, he didn't even make it. Before they even attacked, a Confederate shell found him downtown and ripped his arm off. He was taken to the hospital. They amputated what was left of his shredded limb, and his career as a soldier was over. It was done. But not John Kistler. Kistler got off an operating table and picked up a cracker because he was hungry, and he picked up his rifle and went back out to the battlefield to finish the battle he didn't start. By this point, his regiment had been destroyed, it was routed, his commander demoralized, and as they all came stumbling back on Hanover Street, he met them at edge of town. And one-armed John Kistler rallied the 132nd Pennsylvania and restored their commander's faith and morale. He insisted, "We are not beaten yet. We can do this," and inspired them to go back out and resume their positions. They didn't follow their colonel. They followed this brand new amputee out onto the battlefield. A man who had every right not to be there. I'm amazed at another man who didn't make it out of the town, named David Lincoln. He was from the 14th Connecticut Infantry. He, like Kistler, was caught by a shell that ripped off both of his legs above the knees. As he flopped over on his back on Princess Anne Street, his regiment was shocked into complete paralysis. They couldn't go forward. They couldn't shy away from him in revulsion. They just stood there and gaped. And this man struggled mightily just to sit up, at which time he addressed his regiment and told them it was okay and that they would be fine. And they needed to go do their duty. They needed to leave him. They needed to go. The 14th Connecticut was snapped out of its ennui and went forward. And the next regiment in line also encountered Lincoln, and they were equally horrified. And as they stopped to stare, the man fading away with his blood simply, lightly said, "Move along, there's no show here." Never once did this man ever reach out for help. Never once did he ask anyone to save his life. Because he believed in something that was bigger than himself, bigger than his own life. He believed in duty. He believed in what they were supposed to do. And it was bigger than life. And it was real, and it was palpable. And he gave his life for it, quite literally. And perhaps the most sublime of all these soldiers at Fredericksburg who touch us was a sergeant from South Carolina named Richard Rowland Kirkland. A man who stood behind the stone wall and watched wave after wave of Union attackers get mowed down wholesale. And also heard the cries of the wounded in no man's land, begging for water. At the risk of his own life, he jumped the stone wall and brought water to those troops. And I'm amazed I'm reminded that there is a sage passage that tells us that there is no greater love a man can have than to risk his life or lay his life down for his brother. But Richard Kirkland didn't risk his life for his brother. He risked his life for his enemy. And that is sublime. They struggled, and some of them fell crushed by the terrible arithmetic of war. They were maimed. There were those who were wounded and could not show a wound. They were the ones who had been emotionally and psychologically scarred for just having been here. And their night on the battlefield was equally as horrible as the fight itself. Robert Goldthwait Carter of Massachusetts spent the night lying out on the open field in a swale, unable to go forward, unable to get back, unable to even sit up without being shot at. And as comrades left and right started to die, they would tumble their bodies out in front and make them a human breastwork. Robert Carter spent his night sleeping on the battlefield with his head inside a human body where his spine had been carved out. The 7th Rhode Island, Captain George N. Stone, took a squad of men out on the battlefield to go recover the body of their lieutenant colonel who had been wounded when a shell burst literally in his chest. The problem was there were so many bodies, and it was so dark that it was impossible to tell one from the other. So the men scattered, and each of them had to feel for shoulder straps on the corpses. And when they found them, they would have to move their hands down across their chest. As Captain Stone put it, I discovered that this one particular body, the chest was completely shattered, and one of my hands passed entirely through the cavity made where the exploding shell had been. They had found Welcome B sails and brought his body back, or what was left of it, on a blanket. Many of the survivors had to find food. They hadn't eaten, they hadn't drank, and as they searched through the haversacks of the dead, some of them had more than they could bargain for. One soldier found a full haversack. It was going to be a bounty, and instead discovered there was flour that had congealed with blood from the man who had died. He wrote, I encountered not hard bread, but a paste of hard, clotted blood mingled with flour, and I fled from that spot. I foraged no more, for I was not hungry again that night or ever. Fredericksburg is one of the true milestones of the American Civil War. It was the most resounding, one-sided victory that Robert E. Lee ever had. It was the worst embarrassment that the Lincoln administration had ever faced. Robert E. Lee solidified his preeminence as a commander over the Army of Northern Virginia. Captain Richard Irving's wife gave birth to a son while the Virginia captain was fighting in the woods near here. When asked to name the boy, he insisted that they should call him Robert E. Lee Irby, in honor of the man who had just won such a monumental victory. As Irby wrote, as he was born just as the great victory, the 13th, was being consummated under General Robert E. Lee, I think we must name him after him. And I hope he may prove to be as good, if not as great, a man. With hindsight, the Confederacy would become literally synonymous with Robert E. Lee and his army. And their success would be its success. But that only came to fruition here. Keep in mind that Robert E. Lee only commanded his army for 6 months before being here at Fredericksburg. This battle was the one that made him preeminent. All of these voices, all of these faces, all of these people that I have introduced you to tonight, all represent one common bond, a common experience. And that overarching experience is the battle at Fredericksburg. And what makes that all tremendously sublime to me is one simple last thought. And that is that some people can live their entire lives in a place and never make an impression on it. And some can touch a place only once, in fact, only for a brief moment, and change it forever. This week, in 1862, strangers from faraway places changed the course of Fredericksburg forever. And Fredericksburg changed each and every soldier who fought here. The name of Fredericksburg came to define a besieged community in the cruel grip of war. But the name Fredericksburg also now burned into the collective consciousness of a community of armies, in fact, a community of nations. It was baptized in blood, and Fredericksburg had now become one of only a limited number of communities, a limited number of places that the world knows and instantly recognizes as a place of intense human struggle and drama and loss and rebirth. That is one of the most amazing things that I take away from this.